Imola Circuit is set to return to the F1 calendar again this year, and a contract has been secured until 2025. The circuit is cemented in Formula One history for being the place where Ayrton Senna died in 1994. But which historic tracks have been forgotten and could return? We run you through a list of some legendary circuits that deserve to be back on the calendar, and one track that you can try yourself, so don't go anywhere. First up, Fuji Speedway. Picturesque mountains, luscious green grass, and an hour from Tokyo? What more could you ask for from a racetrack? The Japanese Grand Prix has always been popular with Japanese fans. The Williams and McLaren dominance from 1987 to 1991 saw a boom for the sport in Japan. The two teams had engines powered by Honda, which is a proud Japanese manufacturer. The Fuji Speedway, which was originally built to host NASCAR races, held its first F1 race in 1976. That year would be iconic, as the rivalry between James Hunt and Niki Lauda was at an all-time high. Fuji was the last track on the calendar, and Hunt came in third place, which was enough to secure him the race win. The circuit hosted another Formula One race the next year, but after two spectators were killed in a racing incident involving Gilles Villeneuve, F1 didn't return to the track for another 30 years later, in 2007. After 2007, the Japanese Grand Prix returned to Suzuka and has not been back to Fuji since. But the stunning background of Mount Fuji and the winding road of the circuit is a special atmosphere that would be great to see back on the F1 calendar. Next, Estoril. This next one has a lot of history. Circuito do Estoril is a motorsport racetrack just outside of Lisbon that held the Portuguese Grand Prix from 1984 to 1996. In its first year, Niki Lauda won the 1984 championship at the circuit. It was the final race of the season, and Lauda finished just half a point in front of Alain Prost. It was the start of 13 years of exciting racing at the track. The next year, Ayrton Senna would prove that he was a master of the wet conditions to win his first Grand Prix at Estoril. It was the beginning of Senna as we know him today. In 1989, at the circuit, Nigel Mansell performed an illegal maneuver in the pit lane by reversing back into his team's pit position. He was suspended from the race for this, but ignored the officials waving the flag at him. This wasn't even the worst part, though. Trailing Senna, he came into the first corner aggressively and collided, taking them both out of the race. For his behavior, Nigel was fined $50,000 and banned from the next race. In its last year at the Estoril circuit in 1996, Jacques Villeneuve dramatically overtook his teammate Damon Hill on the final corner. This took the fight for the World Championship to the final round in Japan, where Damon Hill won his first and only World Championship. The Portuguese Grand Prix is now held in Portimao, but it would be great to see a return to a track with so much history. Next up, Kyalami. Kyalami was a circuit in South Africa that played host to the South African Grand Prix from 1967 to 1985, and then again from 1992 to 1993. The circuit remains one of only 3 times that Formula One has raced in Africa. One other race was also in South Africa at the Prince George Circuit, and the third time was in Morocco. Some memorable moments were two-time world champion Jim Clark winning his last Grand Prix victory at the circuit in 1968, Mario Andretti's first win in F1 with Ferrari in 1971, a great battle between Niki Lauda and James Hunt to kick off their legendary 1976 season fight. F1 has said that it is a high priority to return to Africa, and that there have been ongoing negotiations for many years. Lewis Hamilton agrees. He said that it would be great for fans and drivers to be able to experience South Africa again. But F1 CEO Stefano Domenicali said that there is interest from other African nations who are also keen to host a Grand Prix. Kyalami now has a newly built racetrack, and the CEO of South African Grand Prix has said that they will be ready to go by 2023. Which legendary Formula One track can you drive on for just 25 euros? And which forgotten racetrack saw Michael Schumacher's most controversial moment? Stay tuned for all that and more. Now, we have Mosport. These days, the Canadian Grand Prix is held in Montreal. That track is set in a beautiful location on Notre Dame Island. It was built in 1978 and renamed in 1982 after the legendary Canadian F1 driver Gilles Villeneuve. But Gilles Villeneuve had his debut for Ferrari at a different Canadian circuit. It was at the Mosport Park in 1977, which held the very first Canadian Grand Prix in 1961 up until the 1970s. One of the most famous moments of the track's history was when James Hunt punched a marshal after crashing into his teammate. Hunt was winning the race and was attempting to lap his teammate Jochen Mass when the two collided. While a marshal was trying to help him, he turned around and punched him square in the face. The Mosport Albert Park location was notorious for its bad weather conditions. It was the first race to be red flagged in Formula One, with the 1971 Canadian Grand Prix stopped after 64 laps because of poor visibility. The wet track and foggy weather made it difficult for marshals and drivers to see, and so the race director decided to stop the race without a restart. Talk about Canadian weather. Now we have Adelaide. Before the Albert Park circuit in Melbourne was used, the Australian Grand Prix was held in Adelaide, about an hour's plane ride away. The circuit was a street circuit in the middle of the city and held the Grand Prix there from 1985 until 1995. When it was in the calendar, it was normally held in November and was the final race of the season, so it played host to many historic moments over its 10-year run. After a long and dramatic season, the battle between Nigel Mansell, Nelson Piquet, and Alain Prost came down to the final race. Mansell won pole position and got a bad start, but he only needed a third-place finish to secure the World Championship. Then, on lap 64, Mansell's tire blew out. After that, it was between Piquet and Prost. Piquet pitted for a tire change, and Prost was able to hold on to first place to win the championship. In 1994, Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill were separated by just 1 point coming into the Australian Grand Prix. On lap 35, when Hill was attempting to pass Schumacher's Benetton, Schumacher turned into Hill and caused them both to retire. It is controversial whether or not Schumacher did this deliberately or not, because after both retiring their cars, it was Schumacher who was still ahead of Hill and therefore won the Drivers' Championship. Williams was sure that Schumacher had done it deliberately, but decided not to protest given the recent death of their driver Ayrton Senna. Nürburgring Nordschleife. Topping a lot of people's lists for F1 tracks they'd like to see return is the Nürburgring in Germany. In its first incarnation, the track was a massive 22 kilometers long. Niki Lauda set a record-breaking lap of 6 minutes and 58 seconds. With most circuits around 2 minutes long these days, just imagine waiting 7 minutes for the cars to come around again. It was also notorious for its bumpy roads, lack of safety precautions, and uneven inclines that made the cars jump off the track. This led to Niki Lauda asking other F1 drivers to boycott the race with him in 1976 when it was clear that there would be heavy rain at the race. But Niki was right, it was unsafe, and the conditions caused him to crash his Ferrari into the wall and burn into flames. He survived, but had permanent scarring on his head from the crash. This was enough to move the German Grand Prix to Hockenheimring in 1977. By 1984, a new circuit was completed and named the GP Streck. It was up to modern safety standards, but many fans complained that it was nothing compared to the thrilling Nürburgring Nordschleife that was used before. But if you fancy yourself a driver or just want to feel what Lauda and Hunt had to deal with, then you can. The track is open to the public for as little as €25. Just bring your own car. There are countless crash compilations on YouTube, so make sure you don't end up on one. We'd love to see some of these legendary racetracks return to the F1 calendar, but which ones are your favorites? Did we leave any out? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like our video and subscribe. See you next time.